There is a wall in southern Egypt that says the Egyptians did not build the first pyramids. It says someone else did. It names them, it says where they came from, and it says they arrived by ship after their own country sank beneath the sea. Most people who visit this temple walk right past that wall. They photograph the carvings, admire the size of it, and move on. But carved into the stone, in the Egyptians' own words, is a claim that quietly contradicts everything you were taught in school. The people who laid out the sacred foundations of Egypt were not from Egypt. They were refugees, survivors of a flood that destroyed an island home in the middle of a great ocean. And when they landed on the Nile, they did not start a religion. They started a construction project. They walked the length of the country and marked out the exact ground where every future temple, and according to one of Egypt's most respected archaeologists, the Great Pyramid itself, would one day stand. The Egyptians did not call this a myth. They called it history. They called it the first time. And they left instructions. This is not one strange line taken out of context. It is a body of text, thousands of words long, describing a lost civilization, its destruction, its survivors, and the buildings they raised to replace the world they had lost. For 100 years, scholars translated it, filed it under mythology, and looked away. But in the last few decades, something was dug up in the mountains north of Egypt that matches the story so precisely it should not be possible. A city of stone, built by people who supposedly could not build, thousands of years before the pyramids, and then deliberately buried. Today, we are going to read what the Egyptians actually wrote about who built their monuments. We are going to follow the trail off the Nile and into the hills where the survivors went. And we are going to look at the one piece of evidence that turns a temple legend into a real event with a real date. Let's start with the wall. It stands inside the Temple of Horus at Edfu, halfway between Luxor and Aswan. It is one of the best preserved temples in all of Egypt, because for most of its life, it sat buried under sand and village houses, protected from the weather that erased so much else. When it was cleared in the 19th century, archaeologists found something they were not expecting. The inner walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in an enormous body of inscription that scholars now call the Edfu building texts. And these texts are strange, because they are not the usual hymns to a pharaoh. They are the temple describing its own origin. And that origin does not begin in Egypt. The texts take us back to what they call the early primeval age of the gods. And they are specific about one thing. These gods were not originally Egyptian. They were not connected to the Nile at all. They lived on a sacred island, which the texts name the homeland of the primeval ones, in the middle of a great ocean. On this island stood the first sacred structures ever built, the earliest mansions of the gods. And then, the texts say, disaster came. An immense cataclysm shook the earth. A flood poured over the island, submerged the holy places, and drowned most of the divine inhabitants. Not all of them. A remnant survived. And the texts tell us exactly what those survivors did. They boarded ships, they set sail. And they wandered the world with a single purpose: to recreate and revive the essence of the homeland they had lost. Read that again, because the Egyptians clearly meant it literally. A group of people, the last of a destroyed civilization, sailing away from a sunken island, carrying not treasure, but knowledge, and rebuilding their lost world somewhere else. And the place they rebuilt it was Egypt. Now here is where the mainstream reading and the text itself begin to pull apart. Egyptology treats this as poetry, creation mythology. The island is the mound of earth rising from the primordial waters, a spiritual image, not a place on a map. And for a lot of the text, that reading works. But the Edfu inscriptions keep doing something that pure mythology does not do. They get technical. They stop describing gods and start describing engineering. The survivors who reached Egypt are given a job title in the text. They are called the builder gods, and their role is described with unusual precision. They were the ones who fashioned in the primeval time. They were the only divine beings who knew how the temples and the sacred places were to be created. They did not float above the land dispensing wisdom. They surveyed it. They traveled the length of the Nile and established what the texts call sacred mounds at specific points. And these mounds were not shrines. They were foundations. Each one marked the ground and fixed the orientation of a temple that would be constructed there in the future. Think about what that actually describes. A team of surveyors arriving from elsewhere, laying out a master grid of building sites across an entire country and leaving markers so that later generations would build in exactly the right place, facing exactly the right direction. That is not a creation myth. That reads like a site plan. And the orientation part matters more than it sounds. Egyptian temples were not aimed casually. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north to within a 20th of a single degree, more accurately than most structures built anywhere on Earth until the modern era. Its base is leveled across more than 13 acres to within about 2 centimeters. That kind of precision does not come from a first attempt. It comes from an established tradition. Generations of accumulated technique refined somewhere by someone long before the stone was cut. The Edfu texts are telling us where that tradition came from. They are saying the knowledge to align a monument to the poles, to level ground across acres, to fix a building's direction to the sky, did not develop on the Nile. It was carried there, already complete, by the survivors who marked the mounds. The Egyptians were not describing the invention of that skill. They were describing its arrival. And the texts named the people who did it, not just builder gods. There was a specific group among them, 7 in number, and the Egyptians called them the 7 sages. Their special role, according to the inscription, was that they alone knew how sacred places were to be created. And it was the 7 sages who initiated the very first construction at the very first mound. A god of wisdom worked alongside them, writing everything down, recording their words, and those written records were said to survive. The temple at Edfu insists, again and again, that its own builders were working from ancient books handed down from the first time. They were not inventing, they were copying. They were following a plan that was already thousands of years old. That is the claim. An earlier foreign seafaring people, survivors of a flood, laid the foundations of sacred Egypt and wrote down how to do it. Now let me show you why that claim is harder to dismiss than it looks, because there is a second document in a different city that seems to record the same people, and it puts numbers on them. Here's where it gets strange. There is a papyrus in a museum in Turin in northern Italy. It is torn, fragile, pieced back together from fragments, and it is one of the most important king lists ever found in Egypt. Scholars call it the Turin Royal Canon. It was written during the reign of Ramses II, more than 3,000 years ago, and it was meant to be an official record, an administrative document, a list of every ruler of Egypt going back to the beginning. And this is the key point. It is not a temple hymn. It is bookkeeping. It lists kings, and beside each name, how many years he reigned, in years, months, and days. It is the ancient equivalent of a government ledger. And when you read that ledger from the beginning, something impossible happens. The list does not begin with a human pharaoh. It begins with the gods, the Neteru, written inside cartouches in exactly the same format later scribes used for real historical kings. Then, after the gods, comes a category the Egyptians called the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. And only after all of them does the list finally reach Menes, the first human pharaoh, the man mainstream history credits with founding Egypt around 3100 BC. So the Egyptians' own official record says there were rulers before the first pharaoh, 2 whole categories of them. And at the bottom of that section, the scribe did something an accountant does. He added it up. The surviving summary lines give totals. The followers of Horus, 13,420 years. The reigns, Before the followers of Horus, 23,200 years. A grand total, before the first human king, of 36,620 years. Mainstream Egyptology has a clean answer for this. The numbers are mythological exaggeration. Symbolic. No one ruled for 13,000 years. And of course, taken literally, no one did. But look at what the document is, and look at how it treats these figures. It does not set them apart as legend. It puts them in the same ledger, in the same format, in the same handwriting, as the real kings whose existence we have confirmed with archaeology. The scribe who wrote this was not telling a fairy tale. He was recording, as fact, that a line of non-human or superhuman rulers governed Egypt for tens of thousands of years before the first pharaoh. And he was following the reign of Horus, the same Horus whose followers laid out the temples at Edfu. Two separate documents from two separate cities, written centuries apart. One says a group of survivors called the followers of Horus built the first sacred sites. The other says the followers of Horus ruled Egypt for 13,000 years before recorded history began. That is not one myth. That is two records describing the same missing chapter. And if you are the kind of person who wants to know what was actually there before the pharaohs, subscribe now, because this channel investigates the sites and the records the textbooks quietly skip every single week. And we are only getting to the strangest part, because there is a third piece of evidence. And this, one, is not a legend about gods. It is a stone found at Giza in the shadow of the pyramids themselves that says the most famous monument on the plateau was already old when the pharaoh we credit with building the area arrived. In 1858, a French archaeologist named Auguste Mariette was excavating beside the Great Pyramid, in the ruins of a small temple dedicated to the goddess Isis. And he pulled out a carved tablet that historians now call the Inventory Stela. It dates from a later period of Egyptian history, and it is a dedication, a list of divine statues belonging to the temple. But buried in its text is a sentence that has been causing arguments for over a century. It states that the temple of Isis and the great sphinx beside it were already standing before Khufu, the pharaoh of the Great Pyramid, came to the throne. It describes Khufu discovering the sphinx, already there, and building his own works next to what it calls the house of the sphinx. In other words, according to this stone, Khufu did not build the sphinx. He found it. He inherited it. It was already ancient. Mainstream Egyptology rejects the Inventory Stela, and it has real reasons to. The tablet was carved more than 1,000 years after Khufu lived. It contains anachronisms, titles, and names that did not exist in Khufu's time. Most scholars consider it a piece of late religious revisionism, priests inventing a grand history for their temple. And that may be exactly what it is. But notice the pattern. Notice how many times this happens. The Edfu texts say Egypt's sacred sites were laid out by an older people, and they are filed under mythology. The Turin list says rulers reigned for tens of thousands of years before the pharaohs, and the numbers are dismissed as symbolic. The Inventory Stela says the Sphinx predates the man who supposedly built the plateau, and it is written off as a fake. Every one of these documents, on its own, has a conventional explanation, but every one of them is saying the same thing: that the monuments of Egypt were older than the Egyptians who get the credit. That there was a builder culture before the builder culture. And the official response, every time, is not to investigate the claim. It is to explain the claim away. For decades, that was where the story ended. 3 ambiguous texts, easy to dismiss, one at a time. There was no physical proof that any such earlier builder culture had ever existed. The island was mythology. The survivors were mythology. The whole thing was a beautiful Egyptian legend about the creation of the world and nothing more. And then archaeologists put a shovel into a hill in southern Turkey, and the story stopped being a legend. Here's where it gets strange, because the Edfu texts do one more thing that nobody paid much attention to until recently. They tell you where the survivors went when they were done. The builder gods, the elder ones, the falcons, and the sages do not stay on the Nile forever. At a certain point in the texts, they leave. They disappear from Egypt. And a researcher named Andrew Collins noticed something about the timing. In the very region the survivors are said to have moved toward, the highlands north of Mesopotamia, the upper valley of the Euphrates, in what is now southeastern Turkey, the first great monuments of the human story suddenly appear. And they appear at a place called Göbekli Tepe. If you have not heard of Göbekli Tepe, understand that it broke the timeline of civilization when it was excavated. It is a complex of massive stone circles built from T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them over 5 meters tall and weighing more than 10 tons, carved with lions, scorpions, vultures, and foxes in raised relief. It is sophisticated, it is monumental. It required planning, engineering, coordinated labor, and a shared design. And it was built around 9,600 BC. That is not a typo. It is roughly 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. It is older than farming, older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than writing. It was built by people that the textbooks classify as simple hunter-gatherers, people who were not supposed to be capable of any of this. The German archaeologist who led the excavation, Klaus Schmidt, spent years insisting to a skeptical academic world that what he had found was real, that this was a temple, a sacred gathering place, built by people who had not yet invented agriculture. And the carvings on the pillars are not crude. They are confident. Animals rendered in 3 dimensions, stepping out from the stone, anatomically precise, arranged in deliberate scenes. On one pillar, a vulture with an outstretched wing hovers above a headless human figure, a composition so specific it clearly meant something, a story or a rite we will never fully read. Whoever carved it had a visual language, a cosmology, and the organization to quarry, move, and raise 10-ton pillars into rings. That is not the archaeology of primitive people slowly stumbling towards civilization. That is a finished culture, appearing at the very bottom of the record, with nothing beneath it to show how it learned to do any of this. Not similar to the pyramid builders, not inspired by them. Before them, thousands of years before them. And here is the detail that connects it straight back to the Edfu wall. Göbekli Tepe was not abandoned and left to fall down. Around 8,000 BC, the people who built it deliberately buried it. They filled the entire complex in with rubble and soil, by hand, on purpose, and walked away. They took one of the most extraordinary structures ever raised by human beings, and they hid it underground, where it stayed, perfectly preserved, sealed, invisible, for 10,000 years, until a farmer's plow snagged the top of a buried pillar in the 1990s. Now, hold the 2 stories side by side. The Egyptians wrote that a lost builder culture arrived from a flooded homeland, laid out sacred sites, and then vanished toward the north. And in the exact geography the texts point to, we find the oldest monumental architecture on Earth, built by an impossibly advanced people at the exact end of the last ice age, and then deliberately sealed and hidden. The flood the Edfu texts describe has a candidate too. Around 10,800 BC, at the close of the Ice Age, the planet suffered a violent climate collapse that geologists call the Younger Dryas. Temperatures crashed within a human lifetime. Then, when the ice finally gave way, it went the other direction. Sea levels heaved upward by tens of meters, and vast stretches of coastline that had been dry, habitable land for thousands of years drowned beneath the rising ocean. There is a serious scientific argument, still fiercely debated, that this collapse was triggered by fragments of a comet striking the northern ice sheets, an impact event that would have thrown up walls of water and swallowed low-lying land almost overnight. Whole regions where people could have lived and farmed and built in stone are now sitting under 100 meters of seawater, unexcavated, unseen, exactly where no archaeologist can easily look. A great cataclysm at the end of the Ice Age that drowned coastlines and islands and drove survivors inland and upward. The Egyptians did not need a metaphor for that. They lived close enough to the memory of it to write it down. An island home destroyed by a flood at the end of the Ice Age. Survivors who sailed away and built in stone. A builder culture that appears fully formed, with no gradual development behind it, and then buries its own greatest work. Every element the Egyptians carved onto that temple wall now has a physical counterpart in the ground. The Egyptians even preserved a name that echoes far beyond the Nile, the Seven Sages. Because when you go looking, the ancient people of Mesopotamia, just downriver from Göbekli Tepe, told the same story. They spoke of seven sages, the Apkallu, wise beings who came at the dawn of time, before a great flood, and gave humanity the foundations of civilization: writing, law, architecture, agriculture. 7 sages in Egypt, 7 sages in Mesopotamia, and in India, 7 rishis who survived the flood and rebuilt the world afterward. 3 civilizations that were not supposed to be in contact, all preserving the memory of 7 wise survivors of a global deluge who arrived to rebuild. Not similar stories. The same story told in 3 languages, and in every version, the sages do the same specific thing. They do not just survive. They teach. They carry knowledge across the break in history and hand it to the people on the other side. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu bring the arts of the city, the temple, and the written word. In Egypt, the 7 sages bring the plans for the sacred sites and the technique to build them. And a god of wisdom writes their words into books that later temples still claim to be copying from. That is a very particular kind of memory to invent independently 3 times. A flood is easy to imagine anywhere, but 7 specific survivors, wise, foreign, arriving with the blueprints of civilization and the deliberate mission to rebuild what was lost, is not the sort of detail 3 separated cultures land on by accident. It looks less like 3 myths and more like 3 fragments of one real event, remembered from 3 different directions by 3 different sets of descendants of the people who lived through it. That is the case, and it is a serious one. So now, let's slow down and be honest with each other about how far it actually goes. Does all of this prove that a lost civilization from a sunken island physically built the pyramids? No, it does not. And you should be careful of anyone who tells you it does. The Edfu building texts, as carved, are late. The walls we can read today were inscribed in the Ptolemaic period, only a few centuries before the Roman Empire, thousands of years after the events they describe. The texts themselves say they were copied from far older records, but those older records have not survived, so we cannot check the copy against the original. The Turin king list numbers, 13,000 years, 36,000 years, may well be symbolic, tied to astronomical cycles, rather than literal reigns. The Inventory Stela really does contain anachronisms, and Göbekli Tepe, as astonishing as it is, was built by people who were culturally and geographically distinct from dynastic Egypt. There is no carved inscription at Göbekli Tepe that says we are on our way to build the Nile temples. The direct chain of evidence, the thing that would let you say, this person carried this knowledge from here to there, does not yet exist. The connection is inference, not proof. But here is what the conventional story still cannot do. It cannot explain why the Egyptians, at the height of their power, insisted that their most sacred building traditions were inherited rather than invented. Civilizations tend to claim credit, not give it away. It cannot explain why one of the 20th century's most respected Egyptologists, Professor I.E.S. Edwards, the Dean of Pyramid Studies, quietly identified the great primeval mound of the Edfu texts, the very first sacred site the builder gods established. With the natural outcrop of rock that lies beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza and was built into its lowest courses. The Egyptians said the survivors marked the first mound, and the first mound, by that reading, is the ground the Great Pyramid stands on. It cannot explain why Göbekli Tepe exists at all, a monument 7,000 years ahead of its time, built by people who had no business building it. And it cannot explain why the same detailed memory, an island, a flood, 7 survivors, a rebuilding, surfaces independently on 3 separate rivers of human civilization. Even the grounded version of this story is extraordinary. Strip away every trace of the supernatural. Assume the gods were men. What you are left with is still a claim that a sophisticated architectural tradition existed at the end of the Ice Age, that it was carried by real people across real distances, that it was old enough to be half forgotten by the time the pyramids rose, and that the Egyptians knew they were the inheritors of it, not the inventors. That alone would rewrite the first chapter of human history. It would mean the story does not start with Sumer or with Egypt. It starts earlier, with a culture we have almost entirely lost, one that built in stone before the ice had finished melting, and then vanished so completely that we spent the next 10,000 years mistaking their heirs for their creators. The Edfu texts told us this. They told us plainly. An older people came from a drowned land, laid the foundations, wrote it down, and left. We filed it under mythology because we had nothing in the ground to match it. Now we have Göbekli Tepe. And Göbekli Tepe is barely touched. After 30 years of digging, only a small fraction of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating surveys show that most of the great stone circles are still down there, still buried, still sealed exactly the way their builders left them. Whatever those people knew, whatever they carved, whatever they meant to hide when they filled it all in with earth, most of it is still waiting under the hill. And the temple wall at Edfu is still standing. The inscription is still there, exactly where it was carved, telling anyone who slows down long enough to read it that the pyramids were not the beginning. They were a memory of something older, built by survivors of a world that is now under the sea. The books that guided them are lost. The island they came from has never been found, and the rock they marked as the first sacred mound is buried under 6 million tons of stone that we still, against the word of the Egyptians themselves, insist was the first thing ever built there. The wall is still readable, the hill is still mostly buried, and the story it tells has been sitting in plain sight the entire time, waiting for the rest of us to catch up. If you want to see what else the ancient world recorded, and we were told to ignore, watch the next investigation on screen right now.